Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar series, Exploring Charitable Options for Your Clients. Thanks so much for joining us, and a special thanks to our webinar sponsor, Foundation Source. I want to mention a couple of upcoming chapter events. We've got a webinar series, What's Changing with Planner Search and How to Turn It into Client Growth on July 15th from 12 to 1 p.m. Webinar series, Ethics and a Practical Application of CFP Board's Code and Standards on July 29th from 12 to 2 p.m., which will satisfy your annual requirement for ethics credits. So please register for that today. Webinar series, Rethinking Loan Qualification, the Power of Non-Agency Lending Solutions on August 19th from 12 to 1 p.m. Check our website for details and updates. We're thrilled to be joined today by Jeff Haskell, Chief Legal Officer and Executive VP for Foundation Source, and Julia DeMeo, Vice President, Southeast Region, Foundation Source. Before we dive in, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to share your questions or comments throughout the session. We want this to be interactive and valuable for you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julia to begin.
Okay, thank you, Kathy, and hello. It's wonderful to be here today. Thank you to the FPA for inviting Foundation Source to present. As your host mentioned, my name is Julia DeMeo. I have spent the past 25 years in the nonprofit sector and have been at Foundation Source for over a decade, both on the client service side and in the field. I hold a Chartered Advisor in Philanthropy certification from the American College of Financial Planning. I serve as a regional resource working closely with wealth managers, attorneys, CPAs, family offices, and families, helping clients understand the options and the possibilities in the philanthropic space. I'm thrilled to be joined by our Chief Legal Officer, Jeff Haskell. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss the charitable options for your clients. We want you to walk away from this meeting with a good understanding of the most common charitable vehicles and how to help incorporate them into your financial planning. Please note that we will allow time for questions at the end, and if we run out, you can certainly follow up via email. Thank you. So for anyone not familiar with our firm, Foundation Source is the leading provider of philanthropic solutions. Alongside our award-winning technology, our people really make the difference. We partner with clients to provide best-in-class service. Today is in our 27th year. We're proud to support thousands of foundations and nonprofits. Our teams have helped clients deploy more than $2.8 billion in charitable aid to a wide range of organizations and causes, both domestically and around the globe. In addition to our flagship foundation management services, we've assembled a full range of tech-enabled philanthropy solutions that support a wide variety of client needs and objectives, including our donor-advised fund platform that serves individual donors, wealth advisors, and workplaces, our planned giving applications and services designed to support the needs of planned giving fundraisers and business operations on their finance office for all aspects of planned giving programs. And most recently, we have created a fiscal sponsorship. Across all of these disciplines, we offer philanthropic advisory solutions. Here at Foundation Source, I think it's always important to mention, especially to wealth advisors and planners, that we don't manage or custody assets, but we bring a full suite of solutions to empower clients to really create a better world with their philanthropy. We help advisors provide expert charitable giving and philanthropy guidance to your clients. We come into the conversation at many points of entry, whether it be a general information, education, or early planning with advisors and families or individuals. Perhaps there's an upcoming liquidity event. Sometimes we're join in the conversation 3 years in advance, 2 years advance, or 2 months before. So again, depends. And a lot of times in Q4 year-end tax savings, perhaps clients have met with their team and they need a solution that includes philanthropy. For clients needing planned giving assistance, we can help with the details of charitable gift annuities, pooled income funds, charitable trust, bequests, and endowment sub-accounting. Please note we have extensive resources on our website. So today we really want to provide an overview of formal giving vehicles, as well as an in-depth discussion on donor-advised funds and private foundations, including how they may be used in tandem for greater financial and philanthropic impact. We also will review some advanced grant-making capabilities. With philanthropy on the rise and clients, particularly younger generations and women, increasingly wanting to make positive impact with their resources, it's really helpful for advisors to be well versed in formal charitable giving and to discuss it regularly with their clients, not just at year end. Doing so really enables advisors to connect with clients on a deeper level and ultimately grow their practices. As we know, your client's money really has three options or buckets. It's going to go to your client and their family, it's going to go to the government, or it can go to charity. So really, again, philanthropy does need to be part of that conversation. And I really think it's safe to say that most business owners, advisory practices have really evolved and have included robust investment management, estate planning, and tax mitigation disciplines. So the fact that these disciplines are already in place under one roof really makes the addition of charitable planning far easier today than it has been in the past. When charitable strategies are closely coordinated with these three disciplines, the outcomes will always be better for your client than if any of these disciplines are done in a vacuum. And as an advisor, you already have the opportunity to be the trusted advisor central to this holistic approach. So incorporating philanthropy can magnify your efforts for higher impact to sustain growth, reduce clients' tax burden, ensure that the assets go to the people and causes they care about. We also find that philanthropy or having those discussions really opens the door to deepening the relationship by bringing in another dimension of value to the cycle of the client conversation. Achieving broader family engagement, including engaging the next generation. Philanthropy is on the rise, definitely in the high net worth and the ultra high net worth space. The total estimated charitable giving in the United States reached close to $600 billion in 2024. Wealthy donors are passing a staggering US 18 trillion to beneficiaries by 2030. And women really are poised to take control of a substantial share of this money in motion. The tidal wave of the great inheritance is cresting. An estimated $2 to $3 trillion will be passed to inheritors this year. I think the stat is pretty staggering. In 2023, more billionaires were created by inheritance rather than entrepreneurship. So really just as financial planners, you should be prepared to meet the needs of the female and the next generation inheritors to avoid the risk of outflow of assets. The inheritance of baby boomers' wealth is not only the largest transfer of assets in world history. One recent report suggested that 42% of ultra high net worth families do not have a comprehensive succession plan in place. So there's also like an interesting dichotomy between wealth creators and wealth inheritors with respect to philanthropy. So generally, wealth creators, often referred to potentially as generation one, are most concerned with leaving a legacy. When you get into the wealth inheritors, G2, G3, they're sometimes more concerned with making a social impact with their philanthropy. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in that, but it's notable to mention that wealth inheritors are far more inclined to be philanthropic. So obviously there's many personal benefits to family with discussing giving. Obviously philanthropy provides a framework for family engagement and personal achievement. And it really opens the conversation to discuss goals and passions, establish core values, and work across many generations. For advisors, typically assets are stickier. They tend to be emotional when passed on to the next generation. There's just this emotional attachment, and they tend to keep assets where they are as opposed to moving them. Really provides, again, an opportunity to get to know your clients on a deeper level, engage the spouse, and again, we talked about the children. So over the next few slides, we're going to highlight formal charitable giving vehicles. Charitable remainder trust and charitable lead trust are split interest trust, and the donor advised fund and the private foundation are purely philanthropic vehicles. And I think a key takeaway here is both the donor advised fund or the private foundation are eligible to be the beneficiary recipient of these split interest trust. We get that question a lot, and they can be set up in advance that way. Talking about private and foundations and donor advised funds, this is usually the most popular conversation we have at Foundation Source. And I think it's important to note the structure of these vehicles. So when contemplating which vehicle makes sense for your client, it's best to obviously first understand the donor's vision and intent. Private foundations are their own legal entity, whether they're set up as a trust or a corporate structure. They do have an annual 5% distribution requirement starting in year 2 and an annual tax filing. They do offer more flexibility with assets in the endowment and more granting capabilities. IRS rules dictate inherently different granting capabilities. So donors really do need to think through the short-term and enduring goals of their philanthropic giving. DAF accounts sit under the public charity arm. So an individual account within a public charity, they do get the public charity tax treatment. Contributions to either generate a current year income tax deduction for charitable gifts that are made in the future. Both of these can avoid capital gains taxes on appreciated securities that are donated to the private foundation or the donor advised fund. And they can be used for exemption from gift and estate taxes on donated assets. There's definitely tax advantage growth to both vehicles. And contributions to a DAF and private foundation are irrevocable. So ultimately, those assets will go to charity. In terms of control, private foundations are more robust. They offer more control and flexibility. And this notable that it's both on the endowment side, so the type of assets they can hold, and then on the giving side, there's just more options in terms of advanced grant making. Donor advised funds are a more simpler giving vehicle, typically going to 501c3 organizations, the gifts. Tax treatments, there are different tax deductions between a private foundation and a donor advised fund. We have a lot of material we're happy to share. Depending on what is being donated, there's a different tax deduction based on the donor's potential personal AGI. And again, the donor advised fund, because it sits under the public charity, gets a public charity tax deduction. In terms of the investments in these vehicles and how long you can hold them, I think it's, again, really important to note this, there's a wide difference here. You can hold assets in a private foundation way beyond cash and security. So there's a lot of options there. You can donate a lot of different assets into a donor advised fund, but they're typically liquidated very shortly after the contribution. So again, something important to think through strategically when you're contemplating which vehicle makes sense. And again, back to the grant making side, with a private foundation, granting can be to all types of nonprofits, including public charities. So more robust options. You can do international granting. You can do grants to individual for disaster relief, economic hardship. Foundations can have their own scholarship program. They can give out awards and prize programs. They can also behave like a public charity and conduct their own direct charitable activities. So perhaps they wanted to do a soup kitchen or a co-drive or something. And then on the investment side, I'm just going to get to this, that you can do program related investments, mission related investments. You can make grants to for-profit entities when they're supporting the foundation's mission. And again, back to the donor advised fund, typically these gifts from a donor advised fund primarily go to 501(c)(3) public charities. Another kind of key thing to think about when you're looking at this larger sort of philanthropic plan for your client, private foundation assets can move to a donor advised fund. So it's a one-way street. You can't take those donor advised fund assets and move it back to a private foundation. So that should be, considered when you're doing holistic planning. And why would your clients want potentially a donor advised fund? They're a great giving vehicle, right? They're pretty simple. The donor may have smaller charitable dollars to put into a formal giving vehicle. They might be perfectly content with just supporting public charities, U.S. public charities. They're really just concerned about now and not simply perpetuity. They want to be an anonymous giver. So it's a little smaller, usually initial contributions, smaller or more simple investing portfolio with the assets in the vehicle, and simpler granting. Why may your client want a private foundation? There's several reasons, and I think usually one of the most popular one is they want full control. So they want ownership and control over the investment and the granting decisions. Private foundations are also used for legacy creation, a vehicle to pass down to future generations, maybe perpetuity. They like the idea of having a board. They may want to compensate directors. They may be very programmatic and hire staff, paying charitable qualified expenses. They can potentially hire family members that are furthering the mission of the charity. And they might be more robust in their giving and do more with their philanthropy. They might want to get into some grant agreements for major gifts. And then back on the asset side, they may want to donate tangible assets that won't be sold. And we're going to talk a little bit about artwork and some of that in a little while. And are there reasons to have both? Absolutely. There's many reasons to have both. I'll just kind of go over that. So private foundations, they must record their grants on their annual tax return, which is available for public inspection. Donor advised funds, the sponsoring organization is the one that files the tax returns. So donors that give through a DAF aren't required. No one will be able to find out specifically which donors grant it through the tax return. So when making donations, potentially sometimes people may want to give to a controversial, politically charged organization. They could use their donor advised fund to be more anonymous that way. Foundations typically have a defined mission that informs grant making and organizations they support. They can use a donor advised fund for one-off giving, supporting other causes that maybe is a little far away from their mission, but still important for them to give. And another time where we see clients using both vehicles is to maximize their tax benefits. We call this stacking contributions. We usually see this in large liquidity events. So they want to maximize their AGI contributions. Some of the assets in consideration make more sense in one vehicle as opposed to the other. Another time that we see clients have both vehicles, perhaps they had a donor advised fund in an earlier part of their life or career, maybe with a smaller contribution, something's happened and now they're ready or they really want that family foundation. About 45% of our clients utilize both vehicles and have both vehicles. And again, a private foundation can grant to their own donor advised fund. That's legal. It helps assist with meeting their 5% distribution requirement. Sometimes we see that taking place at the end of the year when they have to meet their distribution requirement. They might feel pressure or don't want to be hasty with making grants to charities. So it buys them a little time to be a little more strategic and thoughtful on where and how they want to give. So having both can give donors a full toolkit for achieving philanthropic goals. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and he's going to talk about exploring some of the underused approaches in charitable giving. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Next slide, please. Okay. Just want to start off thanking you for having us here. We're delighted to be here with you today. So for now, we're going to cover at this segment of the presentation the basics of charitable investing, as well as arts and collectibles and a private foundation. Starting with charitable investing, we'll start with a discussion of program-related investments, or PRIs, including what it takes for an investment to qualify as PRI, what are the advantages of making and holding one, a PRI, and then we'll talk about mission-related investments and how they compare to PRIs. Next, please. So first of all, let's not lose sight of the reason why foundations make investments. They do so to increase or maintain the size of its endowment and to make enough income so it can make grants, engage in any charitable programs that it may run, and cover its operating expenses. In many cases, an investment might do a world of good, producing a fantastic charitable return on the investment, if you think about it that way, but uncertain or only minimal financial returns. Since the overarching purpose of a private foundation is to further charitable purpose, Congress saw the need to allow for an evaluation of investments that looks at more than just the bottom line. So from a policy perspective, Congress didn't want foundations to be distracted from pursuing their charitable purpose by a strict need to always look at investments with an eye towards the financial return. Therefore, they provided an exception to what is known as the jeopardizing investment rule. That's where the program-related investment comes in. So instead of looking at only dollars and cents, how we traditionally would look at an investment in a foundation, these rules require a foundation to evaluate an investment based on the potential for charitable returns. Now, these are mission-driven investments where achieving a charitable return is the only thing that matters. That's why the regulations treat PRIs as grants rather than as investments for certain tax purposes. More on that later. We go to the next slide, Julia. So I like this diagram because it shows how program-related investments, they serve as a kind of middle ground, spanning traditional investments and traditional grants. So we can see how traditional grants and PRIs both provide a charitable return, while PRIs and traditional investments both have the potential to provide a financial return. Next slide, please. Now, a PRI can take many forms. It could be in the form of a loan, a guarantee, or even an equity investment. PRI loans can be made with or without interest. They can be either secured or unsecured, simple or complicated, depending on the appetite and the players. The most straightforward example of a PRI would be a no interest loan to an IRS approved public charity. Although a loan can qualify as a PRI, even if the foundation will be receiving interest. The lower the interest rate, however, the stronger the argument that the loan really was made to secure charitable return, to achieve a charitable purpose, and should therefore qualify as a PRI. Now, there are also guarantees, which is an interesting option. A foundation's guarantee can do a tremendous amount of good without having to necessarily part with any assets, at least at the time that you make the guarantee, and hopefully never. A guarantee could be the difference between a borrower obtaining a loan that the lender wouldn't have made but for the guarantee, or perhaps enabling the borrower to obtain a loan at a lower, more affordable interest rate. Note that the mere act of guaranteeing a loan will not count as a PRI or grant at the time of the guarantee. Rather, the foundation would either need to be called upon to fulfill the guarantee, to make good on the guarantee upon default by the borrower or non-payment, or fund an escrow account during the term of the loan with guaranteed funds that are beyond the foundation's recall for the loan's term. Now, equity PRIs, if you think of a spectrum from simplest to most complex, they fall potentially on the most complex side. Because equity PRIs, especially in a traditional for-profit corporation, can pose additional challenges. For instance, a foundation should consider an exit strategy if the company in which the PRI was made has achieved its goals, failed to achieve its goals, or shifted direction entirely. Sometimes, as a condition for the making of an equity investment in a tech company, for instance, it's agreed up front that after the company has fully developed or adapted its technology, or that it's been established that the technology has failed to achieve its promise, that the foundation share in the company will be liquidated or sold to a third party afterwards. And there's often a side letter agreement that's needed to assure compliance with the technical foundation PRI requirements, which we'll get to in a minute. Also, the side letter agreement would importantly commit the company to a specific course of action, like the development of a new drug or the marketing of a product, like water purification devices in underdeveloped countries, making a stated percentage of below market loans to people who are living below the poverty level, or perhaps redeveloping a blighted downtown area. The investment terms offered to the foundation typically will not be as favorable as those offered to commercial investors. The foundation may serve as the lead investor, willing to accept a lesser return to attract other investors seeking a more favorable return. Nonetheless, the foundation should bargain hard to get the best deal that they can to avoid conferring an unnecessary and impermissible private benefit to the company's owners. As we'll get to in a moment, you can turn the next slide, Julia. As we'll get to in a moment, you'll see that one of the requirements for PRI is that you can't have the intent of trying to secure a financial return in the terms of appreciation or generation of income. So the thing is, you might think, therefore, that you have to take horrible deal terms where you get a very small or nominal return just to show that you've complied with that requirement. But it's not so, because there's a tension between that requirement on the one hand, and on the other hand, a requirement to avoid providing private benefit unnecessarily to third parties, private enrichment. Because if you think about it, to the extent that the foundation takes lesser or wretched deal terms to attract other for-profit traditional commercial investors, those commercial investors are being enriched at the benefit of the foundation, which is something a 501c3 is not supposed to do. I guess, unless it needs to achieve this meta charitable purpose that will be furthered by the making of the PRI in the first place. So bottom line is the resolution of the tension is that if you got to take lesser deal terms to make the deal happen, then so be it. But don't do so without even trying to get better deal terms. You should try to get the best deal that you can. So anyway, as I was saying, how do you know if an investment qualifies as a PRI at all? So in order to qualify, it has to be three tests that are satisfied. And the first, the investment must significantly further the accomplishment of the foundation's exempt activities. So what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that the purpose that's meant to be advanced by the investment must be a charitable purpose under Section 501(c)(3) of the code. Here we have to remember that sometimes what we might consider charitable might not necessarily be considered charitable under the code and in the eyes of the IRS. The foundation should review its own articles of incorporation, its charter documents, bylaws, a trust document, along with other restrictions that may have been placed on its assets by donors, or even by the board itself or an earlier board. Many foundations have broad charitable purposes, I'd say most that I've seen, permitting them to engage in any activity that's charitable. Other foundations here and there I've seen have intentionally narrowed their purposes, for example, by limiting its activities to supporting medical research aimed at curing a particular disease, like Parkinson's, for example. In that case, an investment targeted at environmental impact will be incompatible with the foundation's limited purpose of finding a cure for Parkinson's disease. Second, the foundation must have made the investment, this is what I was saying before, with the intention of furthering the charitable purpose advanced by the investment. In other words, the foundation would fail this test if it lacked the intent at the time of the investment to further the specified charitable purpose. So the charitable purpose accomplished by the investment, in other words, can't be just a happy coincidence of the foundation having made the investment. It had to have been made with the right mental intent. Next slide. Under the second test, and this is what I was alluding to before also about investment intent or a lack of investment intent, the foundation's motivation for having made the investment cannot be driven by the production of income or the appreciation of assets. Rather, a PRI should be an investment motivated by the desire to achieve a charitable purpose, not by the desire to turn a profit. If the foundation hits a jackpot, for example, the fact that the investment ended up producing significant capital or income is not conclusive evidence that income or appreciation was the purpose of having made the investment at the time of the investment. This no significant investment purpose test is usually satisfied, thumbnail test, if a commercial investor would see the investment as unattractive. Another key indicator of a lack of profit motive would be the fact that the foundation would be prohibited normally from making the investment under its own investment policy or just a straight up traditional investment as opposed to a PRI. Even if a loan or other investment is expected to produce a high rate of return, other investors still might find the terms of the investment unattractive if the investment is especially risky or speculative in nature. So for example, you might have a high interest note that still might be unattractive to commercial investors because it might be extremely risky and doesn't adequately compensate the investor for the risk. For example, if the venture has unsuccessfully tried to secure loans or equity investments under the PRI's terms from commercial lenders or investors, that fact alone would tend to support the conclusion that the decision to make the PRI was not investment driven. And so finally, the PRI, next slide, must not be used to fund electioneering or lobbying activity. Interestingly, the taxable expenditure rules separately prohibit a private foundation from spending any money on such activities. So in actuality, this is not really an additional requirement or limitation for the foundation, really. The most common method of assuring compliance with this requirement would be to obtain a covenant from the recipient of the PRI funds, the investee, committing them to compliance with the IRS's restriction on the use of PRI funds for political or lobbying purposes. And typically you'd find this covenant in a promissory note or a loan agreement in the case of a loan, or the guarantee agreement in the case of a guarantee, or in the case of a equity investment, it would probably be in that side letter agreement that I mentioned a moment ago. Next slide. So before we go into the tax benefits of this, I just want to clarify a couple of points. So one is maybe it's not really coming into focus for you. How would making an investment further a charitable purpose of the foundation? Let me give you an example or two about that. So it could be, for example, that you have a startup company spun off of MIT. I'm making this up, obviously. And they have a new technology for solar cells that will enable, the efficiency to shoot through the roof, making it economical, cheap to manufacture. It could change everything, except that the company is starved for capital because it's a new and unproven technology. Now, to the extent the foundation has as one of its near and dear charitable purposes is to help the environment and to encourage use of alternative energies to reduce carbon footprint. So this would be a classic case where the foundation really wants this company to succeed, because the more successful the company is in selling its product and having its new technology prove to be ubiquitous and in wide use, that would further the foundation's purpose indirectly of helping the environment. So that's a typical use case. Another common case, and one actually used in the regulations as an example, is you have something called orphan drugs. I don't know if you've heard of this, but there are pharmaceutical companies out there that know that they can develop cures to diseases, but they haven't because it may be a rare disease. So maybe only like 50,000 people in the whole world, have that particular condition at any one time. And so there's not a large enough of a market for the pharma to choose to invest in that drug or vaccine or cure, as opposed to some other drug that would be more profitable because it would have a larger market. So it could be a case that a foundation might come forth and say to the pharma company, I'm happy to provide capital to invest, or a loan, interest-free loan, or really good deal terms to loan you money or make an investment to make this orphan drug a reality and find the cure. So again, by producing the cure, by marketing it and having it available in wide usage, you're furthering the foundation's purpose. So those are just a couple of examples to make this more concrete for you of why a foundation would expect to further its charitable purposes by making an investment. It may not be intuitive right away. So one of the chief benefits of making a PRI is that simply by making the investment, the foundation has advanced its mission, as I've just explained. And the most unique benefit of making a PRI is the ability of the foundation to recycle its limited resources. They call this green philanthropy because money is going out and then coming back. When there's a return on the investment, a repayment of the loan, cashing out of the capital investment, and then the money is going out again. Another part is that PRIs are an explicit exception to the jeopardizing investment rules. So if an investment meets all the PRI requirements, it will not be subject to a jeopardizing investment concern, regardless of how imprudent the investment otherwise might seem. State law governing charitable endowments typically includes investment guidelines that allow for program-related investments. And when calculating the foundation's asset average to determine the annual 5% minimum distribution requirement that Julia mentioned a little while ago, the value of the PRI is excluded from that asset base. So for example, if you have a $10 million foundation that has a $1 million PRI loan, its payout requirement will be calculated based on 5% of 9 million, not 10 million, because it's only based on your investment assets, and a PRI is not considered a traditional investment asset. It's considered a charitable asset. Another significant benefit of making a PRI is that the disbursement of the PRI funds, the actual loan or the actual investment, counts as a grant towards satisfying the foundation's annual 5% minimum payout requirement. Note, however, if the foundation receives any interest or other income, that's fine. It'll pay the nominal 1.39% excise tax rate on that amount. And it's also important to note that if the foundation receives a repayment of the principal, the amount invested, but not the income, the foundation's payout requirement for the next year would be increased dollar for dollar by that amount. Because if you made an investment and you counted the investment towards meeting your payout requirement in that year, the year that you make the investment, it's only fair that if the money comes back, that you're going to jack up your payout requirement the following year by the amount that you recovered. A PRI can be made to any type of organization, but special oversight and investment terms are necessary unless the investee is a public charity or it's a foreign organization that has been determined to be the equivalent. So, for example, you have a church, it needs a new roof, you want to make it a zero interest loan, 50 grand to redo the roof, that's fine. And that would count towards satisfying your payout requirement. Another benefit is that the excess business holding rules, which generally limit the concentration of ownership a foundation and its insiders can have in a going concern, those rules don't apply if it's an equity PRI. However, even though these are all in advancement of a charitable purpose, keep in mind that the self-dealing rules, which generally prohibit transactions, financial transactions between a foundation and its insiders, typically do still apply, even despite the charitable nature of these investments. Next slide and last slide in this segment. Thanks. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about mission-related investments, or MRIs. So a mission-related investment, sometimes referred to as impact investment, right? You ever hear the term impact investment? I'm sure probably everyone has, or most have. That's an investment that aims to generate a financial return while also furthering the investing entity's mission. MRIs are subject to federal jeopardizing investment rules, as well as any applicable prudent investment rules at the state level. Note that the term mission-related investment, or MRI, is not an IRS or a Treasury term and is not found in the code or the regulations. Rather, it's a term that's been coined by those in the sector. So there is no legal definition or formal qualification, for that matter, that would apply. Importantly, they need not meet any of the PRI requirements that we just spoke about. And note that MRIs are different from socially responsible investments, or SRIs, which are investments that pass positive or negative screens applied by the investing organization. So, for example, a foundation might be looking to avoid investments in funds that invest in, the so-called sin stocks, tobacco, liquor, gambling, firearms. That would be considered the application of a negative screen. On the other hand, the foundation might be looking to specifically invest in companies that have adopted fair labor practices, and that's a positive screen. But neither of those things are MRIs. Again, a foundation looking to make an MRI may or may not wish to apply positive or negative screens in selecting investment. Rather, the primary driver would be to make an investment where the nature of the business itself furthers a social mission. So that's what we're talking about with the solar panel startup company. Okay, next, let's talk a little bit now about classification of foundation assets, as that dovetails with holding artwork and collectibles in a foundation. Next slide. So just to start this off as a springboard from PRIs, we were just talking a minute ago about how the foundation actually has two kinds of assets, right? It has investment assets, which are counted towards calculating your 5% minimum payout requirement. And then we have charitable assets that are excluded from calculating your payout requirement. So very often foundation, again, our staff on foundations are confused and maybe surprised to find that you have this dichotomy. And it's reasonable to be confused because you might think that everything is a charitable asset. After all, right, the income that's earned from the foundation's investments will be used to make charitable grants and cover overhead. However, as we're going to see, again, that's really not the case. In fact, the default classification of a foundation asset under the IRS rules is investment use. It's only when an asset is actively being used for charitable purposes, like a PRI, but not only PRIs, or held for that use that it can be classified as charitable for foundation tax purposes. So, again, this is obvious, but let's just level set. When we say what is an investment asset, we're saying that unlike charitable assets, investment assets, as you would expect, are those that are held for the purpose of generating income or for appreciation. The significance of the classification, as we discussed, is that it's taken into account in calculating the foundation's payout requirement. So the foundation's investment assets has, the greater the average value or the balance of total of the foundation's investment assets, right, the greater the foundation's 5% payout requirement is going to be. So a foundation is expecting to acquire an investment asset that has a significant value in proportion to the foundation's overall portfolio. A very important consideration for the advisors, the investment advisors especially, is to ask whether or not the asset is going to produce enough income to cover the increased payout requirement that the foundation is going to be stuck with on account of owning that asset. So, for example, I remember many years ago, we had one foundation that had total assets of 9 million, 8 million of which were tied up in water rights that produced zero income. I guess it was a good investment and it was increasing in value over time, but it produced no income. And that was a problem because the foundation didn't have in a sustainable way sufficient other liquid assets to sustain constantly paying the 5% payout requirement that it was stuck with on account of owning the water rights. So if a foundation does not produce enough income to service its 5% payout requirement that it's generating, that would create what I would call cash flow drag for the foundation, meaning that the asset generates a high payout requirement without producing sufficient funds to cover it. So if the balance of the portfolio does not generate enough income to cover the foundation's increased payout, the foundation would need to rely on fresh annual contributions or the sale of other assets to meet the payout requirement. And additionally, any expenses incurred in connection with the foundation investment assets, including investment management fees, bank fees, and the like, that actually can be used to offset the investment income and reduce the excise tax. But the excise tax is so small to begin with. It's only, again, a 1.39% excise tax on net investment income. And lastly, every foundation should have a well thought out investment policy that helps the foundation maintain its portfolio compliance with applicable federal and state laws. And the foundation, obviously, its investment should conform to that policy. Next slide. Now let's talk a little bit about charitable use assets, which are generally the polar opposite of investment assets. As you might expect, charitable use assets are not intended to generate income like PRIs, right? Rather, they're intended to further the foundation's charitable purposes. The balance sheet of the foundation's annual return, the 990PF, actually lists charitable assets and investment assets on different line items entirely. In order for a foundation to classify an asset as charitable, the asset has to be actively used for charitable purposes. Or if the asset's immediate use isn't practicable, the asset must be held for a future charitable use within a reasonable period of time. Interestingly, provided that an asset meets the requirements for charitable use classification, any such asset would not need to conform to investment policy because it's not a straight up traditional investment. In fact, we've seen cases where a foundation's investment policy was customized to include a special section on charitable use assets, which may, among other things, explicitly condone the holding of those assets and outline what it takes for an asset to qualify as such. So what are examples other than PRIs of what a charitable use asset may be? That could be facilities used in carrying out charitable activities, including foundation offices and foundation-owned museums, schools, and health clinics. PRIs, as we've discussed, artwork, if used and held for this public display or for loan to museums, and assets used in managing and administering direct charitable programs run by the foundation, including office equipment and supplies or even foundation-owned vehicles. Both federal and most state laws contain explicit leeway allowing for charitable investments when it comes to the usual prudent investment rules that otherwise would apply. Next. Now that we know how to differentiate between investment and charitable use assets, let's talk about the benefits of being able to classify an asset as charitable. So some of this will sound familiar. As we just discussed, if it's a charitable use asset, it's excluded from the asset base that is used to determine the 5%. In other words, a charitable asset, again, will not contribute toward the foundation's 5% payout requirement. And where a foundation purchases a charitable use asset, not just like a PRI investment, but purchases an office building that it'll be using for its own programs or artwork that it's going to display, the full amount of the purchase price counts towards a 5% payout requirement. And all related expenses count towards a 5% payout requirement as well. So if you're buying artwork and needs to be restored, you need insurance, et cetera, in connection with its charitable use, that all counts, all those expenses also count towards the 5%, even though they're not grants, they're expenses. Nonetheless, they count. It's important to note that if a charitable use asset is ever sold or ceases to be used for charitable purposes, the foundation will be required to recover the amount originally counted towards a payout requirement. That's just like a PRI, because we said if I make a PRI and the loan principal or equity investment is recovered, you cash out of the investment, you're going to dollar for dollar increase your payout requirement the next year. Next slide. When a foundation holds an asset that it wants to classify as a charitable use asset, again, staff members often get hung up when it comes to the question of how often must an asset actually be used or deployed for charitable purposes in order to qualify as such. Once a year, twice a year, more times, every other year. Like we have foundations, for example, that have classic or vintage cars that they display at car shows. And they want to know, like, how often do they have to haul it out of storage and send it to a car show? It's a big deal. It's expensive, insurance, wear and tear on the car. So is it once a year, 5 times a year, what is it? But the regulations really don't say. It's really based on facts and circumstances. Again, a foundation may own an art collection that it lends out to a museum. Maybe it only lends it out 4 or 5 times a year for a week at a time. Is that good? What if the foundation loans it only once a year, but that for that one loan, it's going to be on display for several months at a time, in that year? Or suppose that a foundation has a really vast collection like the Smithsonian. As a practical matter, it can't possibly loan out every single item or every piece in every year. It's too much. Unfortunately, again, there's no IRS clear guidance, there's no magic number when it comes to frequency and duration of use to qualify as a charitable asset. But I will say that in informal conversations that I've had over the years with outside counsel and subject matter experts at the IRS, but again, not officially, we've been given to understand informally that lending out artwork approximately 2 to 3 times a year would be respected as a reasonable amount, but only the IRS could say for sure. Next slide. And again, thanks. Okay, and now, if the collectible that we're talking about as a charitable use asset is rarely or never displayed publicly, the foundation may not be justified in classifying the collectible as a charitable use asset because it's not furthering an educational purpose. So this is like a big deal because foundation may not have a lot of liquid assets. It may have like a $30 million art collection and maybe $1 million or $2 million of cash or stock. So it's obviously in the foundation's investment to have the 5% payout requirement only turn on the $1 or $2 million of cash and stock and not be counted, taking into account the art collection, because then the foundation is going to go bust. It won't have, unless there are new contributions and donations. It's a big deal. So people are worried, will the IRS respect my classification of this, $30 million art collection, for example, as charitable? So foundations with assets that can't be displayed often, they typically struggle to determine, what are they going to do? What is a game plan to justify its classification of this art collection, for example, as charitable use assets? So there's several reasons why, again, it may not be feasible. So as I mentioned earlier, it may be too vast. For example, I said the Smithsonian. Turns out the Smithsonian Institution's collection is so extensive, estimated at nearly 157 million objects, works of art, and specimens, that less than 1% of the collection is on display in the museum at any given time, presumably because it lacks the facilities to display its entire collection simultaneously, or may be too fragile. Certain artwork happens to be fragile and especially susceptible to damage in transit, so it may be lent out for display only occasionally and maybe only in a limited geographical area. For instance, watercolor paintings tend to be light sensitive and may be displayed only on a limited basis to protect them from fading. Or there could be lack of demand. Another possible issue is that the artwork may be of high quality, but the artist may be unknown or not broadly recognized, in which case museums may just not be interested in borrowing the foundation's collection, as it may have a policy to exhibit the work only of recognized artists. Or maybe it isn't a very famous artist. Maybe it's a Monet. But it may be that it's not in pristine condition. And many museums have policies against borrowing artwork that doesn't meet certain curatorial standards. In this case, only a limited audience, like scholars or researchers, may be interested in viewing the collectible. Next slide, and we're going to draw to a close here. As we saw earlier, there's no magic number when it comes to how many days, weeks, or months per year that a collectible must be on display for it to qualify as charitable. But there are tangible steps that the foundation can take to help an asset merit that classification, including rotating the various pieces, ideally as part of a formal rotation plan if the collection is too difficult to display because it's too big, or publicly displaying the collectible on foundation-owned rented property or a foundation-owned property. For example, a foundation owns an office building and might display the artwork in the lobby or other public spaces, making it open to the public. Or a foundation could periodically rent a gallery to exhibit a large collection, although that may not be feasible because it might be prohibitively costly. Aside from rent, other significant expenses may include packing, shipping, mounting, insurance, publicization, and staffing the viewing events. Foundation also might consider loaning the collectibles to organizations that are not museums for public display. For instance, artwork could be loaned out to a hospital, a university, a library, a community center, or even a high school. Other venues might include shopping malls, office parks, lobbies, or courtyards of buildings open to the public. Lastly, the foundation could make the collectible available for private viewing. In any event, the foundation should broadly publicize the fact that the collectible is on display for public viewing, along with any viewing schedule if it has private viewings. Showcasing the foundation's ongoing commitment by displaying publicly the item at museums and other venues may be helpful, as demonstrated by a log of all efforts made to display the collection, including any declinations. The log could be included in board minutes. And stacking up these helpful facts justify an asset's classifications as a charitable asset may buy the foundation more time to use and deploy the asset for charitable purposes. But the more time that goes by without sufficient public display of the asset, the higher the risk that the classification of the asset as charitable, is, and may be more open to challenge. So, and with that, we conclude. If there are any questions, I know we're drawing close, but maybe we have time for one or two questions.
Thank you so much. It looks like we've got one question here. Do you have to have insurance against damage, theft, ransom, etc.?
Yeah, it's typically prudent to have that, definitely, because you're safeguarding your asset. But I didn't mention this, but I will say that when you loan out artwork to a museum or other public, like a university, it's very typical that the museum or the universities have their own insurance policies. And part of the grant or the loan agreement, whereby you're loaning, not like money, you're loaning the artwork, because you're not giving to them as a gift, you want it back. So typically it'll specify that while the artwork is displayed by the museum or the university, whatever, that they'll include the artwork on their policy to save the foundation money.
Wonderful. And it looks like that's it for today. Jeff and Julia, thank you so much for sharing such insightful and thought-provoking perspectives today. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us. We truly appreciate your time and engagement. Be on the lookout for a follow-up email with the replay link and the PowerPoint deck and a brief survey. And also you'll have the ability to contact Julia or Jeff with any further questions. Your feedback helps us continue to deliver meaningful experiences. So please do participate in our survey. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.